Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage, the podcast. And today, my guest, friends of the show, Charles Siegel and I, are going to discuss all the fun you can have when you have one dot in a sphere and probably 1 or 2 points of Arete. This is not quite a Mage 101 episode, but it probably goes between our normal episodes and the introduction to Mage that I swear I will do one day when I stop agreeing to do other things. One of the questions that frequently comes up is, what do you do with 1 or 2 points of Arete? And a lot of people are like, well, starting characters all start with Arete 3. And I'm like, that's not how that works at all. So, Charlie, do you have strong feelings on what it is like to have that apprentice or very new low-power mage character?
Yeah, and it certainly makes for a very different game than a game where everyone starts with Arete 3. Every time your Arete goes up, sort of the game changes. What you can do changes a lot. Most of the discussion you see around is like, how do you handle it when your characters get to Arete 4 and have access to the 4th dots of spheres and they're crazy? Either taking away because you set up an apprentice game or having someone voluntarily just say, my character just doesn't have any spheres above 1. Also changes the game draft. Like, no one's going to the Umbra with Arete 1. Not willingly, at least.
And with that, so like one of the first questions we get is, what do you do with an Arete of 1 or 2 with very low dice pools? The reductive case of an Arete of 1, you have a 10% chance of botching. And that makes things like rituals, which would be the easiest way kind of to build dice pools, to be very risky. Table may want to come up with other ways of doing a low Arete ritual. With rituals, if any of the rolls botch, the entire effort botches, and that can generate a fair amount of paradox depending on which set of rules you are choosing to do. A few other things, though, that may be available to very low Arete characters are, one, at character creation, it is comparatively easy to do a effect where more than one mage is participating in it. If you're doing a 1-dot spirit effect and you need a bunch of successes and a bunch of people have 1 dot in spirit, and you can come up with a way that your paradigms all kind of jive, you just get to add your dice pools together. You get to add your successes together, which is kind of useful.
The things can get unpleasant if any one of you botches. It's just the ritual problem, but with less time.
You also have the rule that if they don't share all the spheres necessary, but have at least some of them, that they can be an assistant and they just add 1 die to it, which is kind of useful and in certain ways less hazardous, which I found interesting.
Yeah, arguably that's significantly better at this point.
Yes, where it's like maybe you just elect someone a leader. Another one that I thought was actually quite powerful was the realization that the cult background just can give you a whole bunch of extra dice. Until I was thinking up for this episode that maybe your cult grows with you, but there's nothing in the rules that says that you can't have 3 dots of cult and thus 3 additional dice, assuming that you can get your cult together. It doesn't need to be people dressed in robes. It can be a whole bunch of fellow martial arts students that help you prep for an encounter with your big bad. It could be a bunch of online shit posters that help you do recon and perform magic, co-religionists. There's a bunch of options.
Player in a game I ran was playing an Iteration X character. They weren't low Arete, but they had said, you know what? I'm going with Cult 5. I have grad students. Their cult doubled as retainers and allies and all these other things. It was just the same group of people. I thought it was an interesting way to use the cult background. Just grad students. They're helping with your work. Specifically, they're helping.
Be creative with cult. These are easy ways to kind of improve that. The other option, besides increasing the number of dice you have to play with, is reducing the difficulty. If you're dealing with something that is difficulty 4 and dropping it to difficulty 3, that is not a huge shift in the amount of successes. It reduces your chances of botching by about 40%, which is kind of nice, and increases your odds of success by about 10. So don't hesitate to take advantage of resonance or synergy to improve your odds. To me, diegetically, a character kind of becomes established as a certain type of mage because at low power, they had 1 dot of fiery resonance that they just kept leaning into. And you got Jim the Fire Mage, or someone who was particularly adroit at detecting disease that had a calm resonance to them, and that just kind of persisted with them. At low levels, 1 point of quintessence can be quite useful, so 1 dot in node can be comparatively useful. Task to me is the weird one because In M20, the way TAS is used is listed in two different ways. One, it indicates that you need prime 3 to use it, period. Another one is you need prime 3 to have it go into your pattern, but otherwise you can have it go directly into an effect.
I prefer the latter quite a bit. It makes TAS more useful. Because my ambivalence about the prime sphere is well established, and putting a prime 3 tax on even using TAS really goes at odds with how important TAS is in the setting materials that we have.
The other avenue that you have is you can do things to reduce your difficulty. M20 has a bunch of those. By far the most potent is the take an extra turn. It gets 1 point less difficult. And that's pretty easy to do with a little bit of planning to a maximum of -3. Just a reminder, out of the box, the difficulty for a magic roll, or for any roll for that matter, can't go below 3. There is the optional rule that if a difficulty is equal to or smaller than the dice pool that you would be rolling, that it automatically works. So if you want a house rule at your table that says, hey, you have Arete 2, you did something that would bring the difficulty down to 2, you automatically get a 1 success roll on it, I think is perfectly reasonable. Extra time, doing research, having appropriate resonance or synergy are all things that can improve this.
And if you don't want to take, all the time it takes to do research or even take that extra turn, have a unique instrument. Establishing a unique instrument really early in the character can be very interesting, because you're probably going to be using that for the rest of the character's natural or unnatural life. If it's destroyed, then the character's probably going to have a plot thread of just trying to make a new one, if it's even possible to do so, depending on the sort of thing it is. And that's a -1 right there.
Yeah, M20, we have two different types. We have personalized instruments, and then we have unique instruments. Unique instrument is tied to a very particular object, thing, or experience that gives you a -1 difficulty whenever that is used in a particular effect. But if it is lost, you just don't have access to that range of effects until you are able to somehow replace it, which, as Charles said, may not be doable. The other one is the personalized instrument, which is the instrument tied to sphere effects to your affinity sphere. The idea being, at your time of awakening, there was a particular object that you resonated with, and that's kind of your cool thing. Your personalized instrument can also be unique, which gives it a -2 difficulty.
But Arete 1 character doesn't really need that.
Yeah.
It's hard to have an effect at difficulty 5.
Yeah.
with 1 dot. You have to find a vulgar piece of magic you can do with 1 dot, and I could argue that there are a couple, and we can talk about that when we're talking about 1 dot effect.
Or you have to be in a situation where you are in conflict with your avatar and you're fast casting, or something like that. Or you're using
ritual where you fail to roll.
Yeah, and you're trying to restart.
Ritual where you fail to roll, actually.
The last two I have are: 1, use a point of willpower. If you're a low-power apprentice mage, hopefully you're getting a bunch of good nights of sleep, so you're probably going to get that point back in the next day or two, so don't hesitate to get that automatic success. That also lets you get your success pool up to a size where you can have things like duration or scale of some sort.
And if you want to control the access to willpower, remember that Arete 1 characters are often apprentices, and apprentices getting that night of sleep may be a little bit more questionable. Arete 2 probably gets the best sleep of any mage. Your problems aren't big, but you also don't have 18 hours of work a day for your mentor. Again, to use that grad student example, I don't know any grad students who get 8 hours of sleep.
The last thing to consider is, to me, one of the key powers that mages have is the ability for a magic roll to improve a mundane roll, or the ability of a mundane roll to improve a magic roll. If your focus involves craft or poetry or an invocation to a spirit or something like that, it's perfectly reasonable to say something like charisma plus performance or manipulation plus art or something like that will allow you to generate successes, which can reduce the effect of the magic roll. Or more importantly to me, the other way around, because even with an Arete of 1, if you get 1 success and that magic allows you to reduce the difficulty of a decisive blow in combat or a critical argument during a social encounter, reducing that difficulty by 1 when you have a dice pool of 6 or 7 is going to non-trivially increase the number of successes you are likely to get. So do not forget that we have the mundane roll improving magic and the magic roll improving mundane effect, and we're going to talk about that a bunch more. And the last thing I have are house rules of how to deal with that. And I had a couple. One is to allow 1-dot effects to have difficulties below 3. The one I've been chewing on that I'm a little bit hesitant to do is the idea that everyone rolls their Arete plus 2 in dice, but they get a 1-point complication that they need to buy off. The idea of a complication is you start your roll with this thing that will happen, this bad thing or this complication that will happen unless you spend a success to buy it off. So for instance, I could say something like, yeah, I want to see if there are any heartbeats in the area using life 1. And you have an Arete of 1, and I say, okay, as the storyteller, you get to roll 3 dice. But since you are summoning Mikael to detect the flow of fury through the hearts of these folk, if you do not buy off this 1 success complication, everyone hears the cry of Mikael declaring their presence, which may be a little bit counterproductive, or maybe it's something you can roll with. This is something the Trinity system uses. It's core to story path, just an option. Another one I do is sensory effects always last for a useful period of time. I don't ask for people generally to spend successes on duration for something like that. As I said earlier, if difficulty pushes it below 3, you get an extra die instead. This is the opposite of threshold, where if difficulty goes above 9, it adds 1 to your success requirement. What do you have?
A house rule I used a lot back in the early 2000s was that if you botch an Arete roll, you can spend a willpower retroactively to cancel out a 1 and try to pull it back on track. If you get 2 1s, you're still out of luck. But if you have Arete 1, then you roll your die. If it comes up a 1, you spend a willpower to basically say, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. Reality, just don't notice that. And then there's a wide variety of house rules for rote magic, which replace your Arete dice pool with something larger. I use a version where there's some attribute plus ability roll on rotes, which means that Arete 1 character might have a dice pool of 8 for a specific act of magic, which allows those new characters to be very, very effective and even competitive with old timers in the narrow area that they are competent.
In addition to that, Mage the Awakening gives an interesting benefit to rotes in that anything marked as rotes, you roll the dice for it, and anything that comes up a failure, you get to re-roll once. I think that is an interesting way of doing it that doesn't necessarily expand the dice pool to give you a large number of successes.
In general, the goal of rotes is to make it so that you are less likely to fail and botch on things that you are supposedly good at.
Dice pool math gets weird when there are small dice. Again, the roll in which you are most likely to botch is when you have 1 die, because no matter what, you have about a 10% chance of botching, and that is a lot to me. I don't know how many mages would make it through apprenticeship if 1 out of 10 of their attempts at casting something just botched. So if you want to have something, for instance, that the first 1 on a roll is canceled in your sanctum, I would be perfectly fine with that. Or you have reality zones or umbral realms that characters train in where the rules are a little bit different.
Something to remember is that the consequence of a botch on an Arete roll is more or less you get a point of paradox. It's much less dangerous than, say, a botch on a firearms roll. There's no gun that's going to explode in your hand. You have a point of paradox. So if that explodes in your face, that's maybe a bashing? People think of paradox as being this horribly dangerous thing. Yeah, if you have 15 to 20 points of it, sure. But if you're in the 2 to 3 range, which if you're an Arete 1, you're not getting to 15 to 20 unless something really weird is happening. If you're in the 2 to 3 range, paradox is a mild hazard of the job. So you're talking about this 10% chance. I don't know how many apprentices get through it, but it's a 10% chance of getting smacked upside the head.
My thought here is during an apprenticeship, you are likely casting hundreds of effects in an attempt to learn how magic works. So to me, in that circumstance, it could not infeasibly run up. So I wouldn't be surprised if, again, as you had mentioned, Arete 2 probably gets the best night of sleep, that apprenticeship and mastery are probably the 2 cases where you have the most active paradox running around with you. And I think my problem with paradox in a lot of cases is a storytelling problem. There are a non-trivial number of storytellers who are like, aha, paradox is my opportunity to prevent you from doing anything useful in this game session. So it is partially a response to me hearing horror stories of players at tables where paradox had been thoroughly weaponized in a way that to me does not come out of the rules. But that's me. The most common use of, or the most common listed uses for 1 dot effects is sensory magic. And sensory magic to me is always weird because a lot of times I get the impression that players just think that they get like Terminator vision, that they now have an additional spectrum of light that they now see the color of fate, or they now see the color of life and health, which is fine, but to me it is uninteresting and frequently too specific. I am perfectly fine saying you get these vague notions and using nonsensical language. Like, for instance, you can taste the degree to which this person's knee is still causing them pain or something like that. To me, it is important for magic to be a little bit weird. How do you run it?
Depending on the instruments used, like I have definitely described having additional senses. I've used the word synesthesia in descriptions of things, because there are not words in the English language, at least not the version that us non-mages in reality speak, that can describe the sensation of having a sense for the probability of various events around them. On the other hand, it's really, really easy to describe what you get if you're talking about like a techno mage who's working with a monitor that's showing them stuff.
This is what's coming up on the Chancescope.
Then next to them, there's the cultist who's, tasting green and stuff and comes up with roughly the same answer, but in weird metaphor. Like you might say, well, there's a 1 in 6 chance. Euthanatos, who specializes in games of chance, is saying it's the same as getting a 1 on a 6-sided die, which is the same thing, but they're feeling it differently. Mm-hmm. They're feeling it in terms of whatever it is they already think in terms of.
My closest sense for the cultist entropy sense is I work in insurance, and sometimes I will just look over something and I'm like, there is something wrong here. I don't know what it is yet, but my math senses are tingling, which I imagine has occurred to almost anyone who's developed an expertise. It is not an obvious thing. Like, again, my Chancescope did not go off. It was just this vague sense of unease. And in the game, if your goal is ultimately to interpret this as a mechanic which gives a -1 or +1 difficulty on a dice roll that somebody has, you don't need to get too specific. Remember, this is not a physics engine. You do not need to be able to perfectly describe the world, and do not hesitate to say, the conclusion I think you will draw, what does that look like to your character? 1 dot is the space where a character really gets to establish how they see the world. It will change over time, but it's a very useful initial exercise. I guess the one house rule I do is I am perfectly fine with the avatar kind of doing some of these things. One of the problems with sensory magic is, especially from anyone who's ever played D&D, like, okay, new room, I check for traps. Ugh. I don't want to get into that trap, and I don't want to bring a game to a screeching halt as everyone rolls sensory magic for everything. I am perfectly fine doing something like, hey, you get a nudge that there is something to the warp and woof of the magic in the area that you may want to investigate. And then the character's like, I look with my special eyes. And then you can give information that way. I tend to be pretty generous in that regard, again, just because I don't want to have to deal with constant low-level Arete rolls, as people are like, I check for the worm taint, which isn't actually an effect in this game.
I also want to avoid that constant rolling. Generally, the contract I end up with my players, whether implicitly or explicitly, is if there's something interesting magic going on, I let them have an awareness roll to pick up on it. And once they've succeeded on an awareness roll, they can investigate however they please. In order to avoid, I'm just going to, even if there's a chance of botching, get enough successes that I have my magic sight on for the next week. I tend to have plot penalize having much in the way of constantly on effects when you're in public, and most of which are actually 1 dot things that we'll talk about later. Magic visions, mind shields, things like that. If you're just walking down the street with them, everyone who passes you gets an awareness ping. If they have awareness, they can sense that there's something up with you that is interesting to them. If you are trying to be stealthy, you don't have these effects up. And it takes much higher levels of spheres in order to put these effects up and hide them.
One of the optional rules that is listed in various editions is for each additional sense you have beyond the first, you have kind of a -1, or pardon me, a +1 difficulty to perception or perception-based check. So if you're like, I want to see the flow of magic and how alive people are and how fate is done, you're like, okay, so that's 2 additional ones beyond the first, okay, you get +2 difficulty on every perception you check as you are trying to separate these various things out. So I'm perfectly fine with that. Plus, for each two continuous effects you have, magic difficulty increases by 1. You also have the optional domino effect where, well, if you do 5 different sense rolls, each beyond the second, for every 2, the difficulty of subsequent rolls is going to increase by 1. So it can get, there are ways of reining this in should you want to.
Kind of on the topic of, those the various penalties and such, it's remember that like the information that characters are getting from these effects is stuff that the mundane mind is not really equipped to get in this way. It is sometimes going to be overwhelming. It's just going to be bizarre often. They should not be comfortable having this on at all times. It should make them feel weird in some way. I think I even remember in some book, probably a tradition book, Virtual Depths, one of the editions. It's like use 1 dot of any sphere, get 1 success for just a flash of information to wake you up. Just it's a shock to the system, and that left an impression on me as like these senses are not easy to control or to work through. Even just having a flash of any of these is enough to wake you up if you're feeling sleepy. That says something about what they are if you just have them on for a while.
The one weird one that comes to me is frequently effects will indicate that you can use a 1 dot effect or roll perception plus awareness. And perception plus awareness is probably going to be a vastly higher pool. So to me, it is important that your 1 dot sphere effect with 1 success is greater to me in terms of utility than probably 3 or 4 successes on an awareness plus perception roll.
In my games, at least, perception plus awareness tells you more successes, tells you more about where the weirdness is happening, not much about what the weirdness is happening, unless it is a weirdness you are capable of. Like if you are a mage with a bunch of dots of forces, then maybe your awareness will tell you, oh, that's a weird forces thing that's going on. There's some force-based anomaly that you are looking at. No mage is really going to be able to just identify vampiric thaumaturgy with an awareness roll. Mm-hmm. All they get is, there's a weird thing happening. And then at very high numbers of successes, you can start picking out resonances and so on. Other than that, like if you want anything really specific, you have to go into 1 dot sphere effects.
So let's talk about the actual spheres. Just as a note, I assembled this list by going through M20 Core and going through the common sphere effects chart, the description of each sphere, as well as searching how do you do that for every instance of sphere name space 1. There may be other things, like for instance, there's a random thing in M20 Core that says if armor is one of your instruments, Prime 2 can allow it, plus a point of quintessence, can allow it to soak ag. I don't know of that being referenced anywhere else, but it's there. So if I have missed something, please know that I did not go the sphere name space 1 treatment for the entire M20 Core. Charles and I both have families that we would like to see. To me, this is comprehensive-ish.
We could come up with more by just being creative and staying within kind of the realm of, well, it's kind of perception-y and it's got something to do with the sphere, and you can come up with however many things you want that way.
Yeah. Just a note, and Charles and I were talking about this before the show, and it was the 2 levels of spheres where the spheres kind of ignore what their sphere does is sphere.5, where you're like, screw you! There's bacteria on that wood. I can control that wood pile now. Eat it, matter. Or alternatively, Prime 5, you have extra health points. Don't I need life? Can't hear you over the sound of me being a Prime Master. The other one is 1 dot, where it's like, yeah, you can do this. You can use entropy to figure out if someone's sick. Why? It's a bad fate thing. And you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. It's very, yeah. Entropy 1 can detect the weak point in an argument. Sure. Or detect people are lying by their changes in their biochemistry. Sure.
At 5 dots, there's so much you can do that you barely need the other spheres anymore. And at 1 dot, there's so little you can do that they all do the same thing.
Yeah, it's just kind of a gimme. So let's start with, we'll take the spheres in alphabetical order. Correspondence, which is listed as immediate spatial perceptions and landscape of the mind. This allows you to intuitively orient yourself. You know which way is north. Or to me, if you are in another area that uses another system of orientation, for instance, maybe you know the direction towards Mecca, if that is useful to your paradigm, or Mount Meru, or the sea if you are an island practitioner. If you are in an umbral realm, you can detect the direction towards and away from the Sea of Language or something like that. Pardon me, the Great Ocean or something like that. That to me is perfectly fine. You can see behind you and see without light.
On that umbral one, I would be careful to say that for correspondence one, I would require it be inside the same realm or closely connected set of realms, because you want to keep Spirit One to have something.
Yeah, given that you are in the Vulgate, you always know the direction of the Great Ocean.
Yeah.
You can detect invisible objects because their objectness is still there. You can accurately estimate distance.
You are the best surveyor on the planet.
Exactly. for this one moment, you are the chosen of small plastic flags. You can notice spatial anomalies created by other correspondence effects. It gives you kind of a vague sense of a battlefield. It gives you this ability to have kind of an eagle eye view. You can roll to reduce the difficulty of coordination. If you have, it's like mine 3, I'm like, or a radio. You can dodge something more easily by precisely moving out of its path, and you can map a place ahead of time to make teleportation easier. Again, teleportation is certainly not a 1-dot thing, but it was one of the rare cases where it's like, use this effect and then this effect. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool.
It also has the advantage of, if somehow you end up doing the very ill-advised Mage dungeon crawl, 1 dot of correspondence is like having graph paper. We should probably not bother going into, you can detect anomalies created with this sphere for every sphere. Every sphere can do that at 1. It's super useful. This is something that characters with like 5 dots of spheres will do on a regular basis. Like, oh, I'm a master of forces. Forces 1. Let's figure out what's up with that. And the other thing is, you mentioned the battlefield sense talks about using Mind 3, and you're like radios. One of the joys of Mage is that you can set it in any time, and you change the factions a little bit, but the game just functions. Historically very useful effects are just things that you can do now. Like, you have an eagle eye view of the battlefield. Yeah, I have a drone, yes. And later we'll get to, what time it is. Yes, I do have a phone. I could, for every sphere, name a first dot effect that, yeah, you just have that now, pretty much. Because that's where our society is. But if you, say, are playing a M20 Sorcerer's Crusade game, these are super useful things to have magically.
The first known clock was not a water clock or a mechanical clock, but a guy that had just casted time 1. And everyone's like, "Hey, Bob, what time is it?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's how we figured it out."
I am not kidding if I say the first sundial was a time 1 wonder.
Moving on to entropy. Entropy 1, as listed, gives you sense flaws. And at first, this lets you identify weak spots indoors without matter, or that somebody is prone to injury in a particular place. To me, this is a way of saying you don't know what the flaw is. You just know if you push on it, something will happen. It's like, I don't know if he has a torn meniscus or previously broke his knee, but hit him there and bad things will happen.
Yeah, so that guy's left leg is weaker than his right leg. I should attack from that side. -1 to difficulty on your attack roll.
Mm-hmm. The next one that is pretty common is Ring of Truth. You identify the slight changes in a person's body indicating that they are lying. And how do you do this? This is broadened to all personal tics that suggest their mood, and it is indicated as being a way to get a reduced difficulty on charisma or manipulation, or subterfuge to tell if somebody is lying.
This tells you if the person is knowingly lying, if they're trying to deceive you. It does not tell you if they are wrong.
You gain the ability to detect if someone is under a fate-bound oath, if they are affected by a geesh, or if they have flaws like dark fate, which to me is kind of interesting. That is one of the ones where a 1-dot effect is awfully personal. in kind of an interesting way. You also gain the ability to detect, it is listed as sense, fate, and fortune. You can detect probability. You're not necessarily a hyper-accurate probability calculator depending on your paradigm, but you kind of get a feeling where you're like, okay, this lottery ticket's the good one. To me, this is a case of you could figure out which scratch-off ticket would be a good one, but you would have no ability to pick a lottery number, or at least that would be my interpretation.
Yeah, entropy tends to be one where the difference between the first few dots especially is a little bit fuzzy. And one way I've explained to people is you flip a coin. With entropy 1, you can tell whether it's going to come up heads or tails. With entropy 2, you can make it come up heads or tails.
Next sphere, forces. This lets you to perceive additional forces. You can see into the IR, the UV, the X-ray, the radio, or any other energy spectrum. This is another case to me where it can get a little bit weird because it depends on how real you consider certain forces to be. I could picture someone having a certain Victorian sensibility who's like, no, I can use it to detect animal magnetism, but I couldn't use it to detect X-rays or something like that because I have no concept of it. And I'd be like, maybe that goes in the things that I will fudge. I imagine you have a long list of interesting cases where people have used these. I just get that sense from you.
This comes from having of people seeing, oh, the storyteller is deep into physics knowledge, so I'm going to use forces 1 to do all sorts of weird physics crap. Usually you'd think it's matter 1 to figure out how much something weighs, but gravity is a force. So you can use forces 1 to know how heavy everything around you is, which can be a really useful thing in a crisis to know, 50 kilogram weight hanging from the ceiling, I can drop it on someone and it will hurt a lot.
One of these statues is empty and I don't know which, and I don't want to have to smash them all open to find out, but that one has less potential
and I don't
energy
have
to it.
And I don't have matter 1 to just, look and know which one's empty. Like, well, that one weighs less, or that's not really gold. It doesn't weigh enough. There's a lot of matter stuff you can mimic by just knowing how much everything weighs very precisely.
Yeah. Which for me, I would probably require more than one success to hone in on another sphere. But
You might require more than one success, but it's a thing you could do with this. Like, this isn't one dot of a sphere and one success. It's what can this dot do?
Yeah. And to me, detecting IR is terribly handy. So one, you get the idea of sense amplification. Yeah. If you become hypersensitive to light, you can see in a low light environment, maybe not completely dark. I have an IR camera, which is surprisingly accurate, and I love using it because it is one of those things where I was curious about how sensitive it was. So I stood outside on a cold day, and it was able to tell a few seconds, up to about 20 seconds, where a car had driven over in the road if it was going particularly quickly because of the change in temperature of the asphalt caused by the contact of the vehicle against the ground. Likewise, would I allow someone to use IR sense to figure out which door had been most recently opened or where the person they were pursuing had run via the footprints? Probably.
But with more than one success, because you're kind of hitting on some actually higher dot time magic there.
Yeah.
I think everyone has used Forces 1 for night vision at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're really playing the gritty World of Darkness displayed in things like Destiny's Price and Outcast, do not use your UV light vision. You will see all sorts of things you don't want to see.
Proteins everywhere. To me, it also says you can see kinetic energy. You can figure out, and this kind of goes back to the question of weight or mass. And to me, that's also implies that you can see potential energy in various forms. You could figure out, again, we're doing that thing where you probably need multiple successes, be like, oh, okay, this is a half-charged battery, or this car battery is actually quite charged, or this is dead, or the amount of potential chemical energy contained in something to identify an explosive. This, again, I think you would have to justify to a storyteller, but at my table, if you've only got Arete 1 or one dot in it, I'd be perfectly fine with it. IR vision, you can detect vampires. You're like, that's a blank body. That person is not giving off heat. This is an important thing to notice.
If the other parts of the World of Darkness are there, mages will cross over with them because mages can find them really easily. Vampires are so easy to find with first dots of magic that they have to make excuses for why the technocracy doesn't go up against vampires constantly.
I think my favorite answer is they're icky. like, does anyone actually want to deal with vampires? Everyone's like, the Syndicate makes money off of them periodically.
Quasi-canon, and definitely something I've used at my table, is vampires don't really matter. They're not causing us any active problems, and they clean up their own messes most of the time. So we're focused on other things that are real problems.
Yeah, It's one of those things where, like, oh, if we could get Americans to go to a slightly lower salt diet, that would likely save more lives than all action done by all North American vampires in a given year. So I could, and that's probably cheaper. Like, the only big canon thing where it influenced mortal history was probably the rise of Zapathosaura. Like, I'm hard pressed to think of any others, except for some of the one-y things where everything was vampires, like the Great Chicago Fire or what have you.
We don't talk about that version of the World of Darkness history.
It's super fun, though.
Except for each of us has like one thing in there that we love and we insist is true to this day.
Yes.
Being able to see in low light environments or like hypersensitivity to light and so on. We also mentioned earlier that you can share perceptions when you're in physical contact with someone. Something that has come up in a game I was running is someone grappling with an opponent and then closing their eyes and then flashing them super intense Forces 1 vision to blind them. So you can use first dot effects offensively on other people if you are clever about it.
I prefer to think of Mage frequently as not a physics engine, but a dice engine. So I am almost always fine for a 1 success to turn into a +1 or -1 difficulty for just about anything, or to stun someone for 1 round, or to distract them. So yeah.
I'm generous on 1 success, on whether or not you have to spend the success to affect someone else if they're like your friend and you're helping them. But when you're using it as an attack, you definitely have to spend that success to get it to work on someone who does not want you to do it to them.
Mm-hmm. And narratively, that may buy you a moment or let you slip for free or something like that, but it's not going to cause someone's like inner eye to go blind, hopefully.
Yeah, one of the things that I stick with pretty strictly is I insist on rule symmetry between PCs and NPCs. Just it's part of my sense of fairness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I do take into account what happens if the NPCs can do this the same way before I say a player can just do something.
Life gets you the ability to determine someone's level of health, their presence, so it's kind of a detect living thing, determine someone's age, sex, overall health. To me, you can use this to kind of detect cyborgs through like lacuna. Likewise with night folk, they're like, they've got something extra. You don't know what it is, but there's something weird. It also indicates that you can perceive the biological clues that indicate that somebody is lying, or determine someone's mood to make a conversational approach or an argument more tuned to that person.
Your example of being able to detect cybernetics by the absence of the things that they're replacing, that actually came up in a game I was running not too long ago, where that was actually part of the explanation for why the original DEI brain scoop implant for Iteration X was replaced by the sort of mesh on top of the brain implant. You can't detect it. Nothing has been removed. You have to have some other technique to find it. If edX has had their morality center scooped out, they're going to need some reason that's not moral for changing what they're doing. It does lead us naturally into matter.
What it says is matter perceptions. See if something, and this is kind of an interesting like tactile X-ray effect where it says you can see what something is made of, but at a remarkably deep level, it does 2 things in an interesting way. You can see if something has hidden layers or hidden compartments. To me, this kind of screams out for knowledge rolls to be able to interpret this. But later on in how do you do this, it makes a note that says with matter 1, if you're handling something unfamiliar and you spend some time with it, you gain 3 temporary dots of understanding for a day or 2 about the material. And this to me kind of suggests that matter 1 can help you make sense of technocratic metamaterials or children of knowledge special stuff, where normal methods of perception or interacting with it would only tell you'd be like, yep, this cloth is super strong. Whereas with matter 1, you now have 3 dots of knowledge temporarily in that material, which I thought was kind of interesting. It also mentions that, for instance, you could handle a poison and have some idea of what it is. And remember, this kind of needs to go through the lens of focus. It is not unreasonable that your technocrat's instrument for this is chemical assay. It is just the fact that theirs is giving you vastly more information than maybe what a mundane toxicology lab would be able to do in 5 minutes.
So that's actually one of my favorite effects from when I used to be on the player side of things. It's especially useful to write down everything that you get from that intuitive, like specify that you are writing down everything you can think of with that, so that you, if you're a materials person, you are now able to try to reconstruct how to make this material, even if it's just a mundane material you haven't run into. Another use I've had for it is an artist working in a medium that they are unfamiliar with can just get a quick crash course in that medium. Pattern spheres tend to get associated so strongly with techno mages of various sorts and high ritual magic in the case of forces. Just a reminder, Matter 1 is super useful to cultists, to Verbena, to Hollow Ones. I don't know, Matter 1 often gets dismissed by a lot. Matter as a sphere in general gets dismissed by people way more often than it should for non-techno mages, I think.
The one that I found interesting is it kind of suggests that matter would let you kind of map out a place, that it kind of gives you extended contact with something. You could sense the wall behind something or the rough layout of a place. Yep. You have no idea what's in it, but it gets you a floor plan.
You could arguably have a rough idea of the non-living things in it, depending on paradigm and successes and so on. So yeah, we've got some overlap between correspondence and matter there with mapping. You are getting different information. Correspondence is just telling you how the space is configured. Matter is telling you, oh, there's rock here, or this wall is made of bricks. Yeah, there's a facade on it. You see drywall, but underneath the drywall there's bricks, or underneath the drywall there's nothing, and then stairs. As I said, I'm a big fan of matter, and Matter 1 is really useful. You think about how to do. One of the recurring things is that each of these spheres at 1 dot is super useful, even in non-mechanical ways, really, if you think through how to actually use them and what would be useful information to get. Any forensic scientist who wouldn't give an arm and a leg for a first dot of any sphere is not serious about their job.
Yeah. Next up, we have Mind. Mind has an unusual number of things out the gate. One is sense thoughts and emotions, in the sense of, does someone have thoughts and emotions, and what roughly are those feelings? You can detect resonance and guess at weak signatures or outright no stronger ones. The guidelines on what that is are not really clear. To me, weak is 1 and stronger is 2 or greater. You can create a mind shield to prevent mental intrusion. That is 1-for-1 success. This includes being able to shield your aura. I have no idea why auras in the game are considered mental. That's always been a little bit weird to me. You can use mind empowerment to raise a mental trait by 1. You can shift your aura color. You can multitask. You can split up your mind to do multiple things contemporaneously. You can detect lies by interpreting the mental stutters that somebody has as they do distruths. This is interesting. It's an unusual number of things. Charles, what are your thoughts?
If you are offered 1 dot of any sphere, you pick Mind. Mind is really the only one that lets you do things rather than just perceive things. Like with life, you need 3 dots to increase your dexterity by 1. With Mind, you need 1 dot in order to increase your intelligence by 1. If you want to just really amp things up, increase your perception by 1. For life, that's a 3 dot effect, but for Mind, it's 1. Mind Shield kind of falls into the sphere versus same sphere counter magic category, but it's somehow feels like a stronger thing to a lot of players. Like detecting lies doesn't, like, that's 1 dot in other spheres, sure. And then there's the aura stuff, and I don't care for auras. I just don't include them in my games, basically. It's undermined because Auspex has astral projection at the top.
Do you house roll any of these? Like, for instance, do you move the mind empowerment to another level of mind?
Yeah, I put mind empowerment at 3. And as I said, I just don't use auras. If your character has a paradigm that includes auras, that's how you're perceiving things like sense, thoughts, and emotions.
Yeah, that's perfectly reasonable. The mind shield I kind of get, because it's one of those weird things at a distance that can harm a character that you can't see coming. But again, as you mentioned, it's more or less counter magic. The acceptance is a mind shield can be raised ahead of time, where there isn't really a good way with 1 dot to preemptively anti-force something. So it's
yeah.
And it's also one of those things where, at least for me, mind affecting abilities have the ability to like break a game very quickly in certain ways. That is considered problematic, but not necessarily lame, in the same case of being pursued by an Atlas or a Technocrat in a tank for some reason.
With Mind Shields, keep in mind, as I said earlier, I tend to discourage people walking around with a ton of prepared effects. Mm-hmm. So that puts Mind Shield a bit more on an even footing with, counter forces. And especially if you're targeted with something, you always get an awareness roll. So you can start your counter magic immediately. You're just working at Arete 1. Yeah, one of the things that drives me nuts with Mind is that, and this was a discussion just the other day that I was having with people, that the Mind Sphere is often focused on being intrusive. Like, aside from game-breaking stuff, there's in many ways harder to use Mind 3, say, ethically than it is to use Matter 3. Part of that is that a lot of the, like, you want to affect yourself stuff with Mind just got shoved into Mind 1 for some reason. Like, a lot of it is that Mind has a weird distribution of powers to levels, and so shuffling that a bit helps a lot. I shuffle Mind more than I shuffle any other sphere.
Mm-hmm. I generally don't have a problem with Mind, quite simply because I have historically played with tables where we do not emphasize the intrusive aspect of it. I personally am quite comfortable with Mind 2 to kind of nudge someone's mood. To me, that's not much off of giving someone a cup of coffee or saying something in particular to get them going. Mind 3, I have almost used exclusively used in just kind of the telepathy. It's great for group coordination or ways to keep track of people, but that's just how I have nudged it at my table.
But yeah, if you do that, then these higher dots of Mind are a lot smaller in scope than other spheres at say 3. But if you increase your mental attributes from 1 to 3, like your physical attributes is, then Mind 3 now has a few things you can do with it that are interesting.
I think given the choice, if I had 1 dot of anything, it would probably be 1 dot of entropy. Partially as an actuary, that's the direction I would go there.
You're never going to convince me that I'm not going to get more benefits at work out of an extra dot of intelligence than I...
Yeah, the problem is, I guess if we're presuming that we all have Arete 1, the 1.1 time increase in intelligence, I'm like, it lasts for a scene, I don't know. So Prime gives us a weird cross-section of things. One is Etheric Senses. You can read resonance or synergy and identify quintessence, as well as I would presume the resonance or flavor of tasks. It helps you find wonders or other things that contain quintessence or lingering enchantment. To me, Prime 1 lets you detect ongoing effects. And that is part of the reason why it is weird to me for certain matter transformation effects to be temporary, because then you would be able to detect that something is eventually maybe going to switch back. And I'm not quite sure. I haven't resolved that mentally yet. You can absorb quintessence into your pattern from a node, so you can store more than your avatar rating. You can consecrate an object. You can mark it with your resonance. It follows you when you step sideways, and so on, which to me always raises interesting questions about, so what happens to your clothing when you cross through a shallowing? Does it just kind of just land there along with your backpack and your cell phone or something? I've used this in games when someone needed to bring something into their domain, and they're like, I need to consecrate this because I need to present this weird thing that has been skulking around my dream palace with this particular object or bit of information.
My interpretation of the shallowing question is that the consecration is necessary to take it with you stepping sideways. If you bypass the gauntlet by just walking through a shallowing, everything just comes with you. It's fine. But if you step sideways without consecrating anything, you're naked.
Okay. And then being hit by the Avatar Storm partially.
Yeah, this is very bad if you are, say, a techno mage and all of your equipment is left behind.
Which hopefully you've gone through the process of attuning your primal resonance to it. What would it, your matter signature or whatever. The quantum frequency would probably be my favorite. Get in there, Star Trek. Another thing it says is you can infuse physical contact with feelings. Okay. This is one of the weird things that's listed in how do you do that, where it's like, so you're boinking someone and you want them to know how good you feel. You could do this with Prime 1. I'm like, good thing that got real space. In actuality, I'm fine with it. It gives you this vague ability to infuse feeling into a thing. There's an optional rule in how do you do that allows you to turn health into quintessence on a 1-for-1 basis. You can sense the afterglow of magic, which lasts for about 5 minutes after an effect, unless it's something very big. Prime lets you do a bunch of stuff.
The infused contact with feelings one is one of the ones that I would probably push to Prime 2, and I would just say, you know what? Screw this. Screw some of these conjunctions. You can just make very ephemeral stuff with Prime 2. It doesn't last very long necessarily, but a feeling doesn't have to. It's just there. If you want to make it last more than blip, then you need the other sphere to make like. Prime 2, Mind 2 in order to make the feeling really last, but, which is, I think, kind of how it's intended to be read. You're basically shoving quintessence into the feeling to make it more. And, yeah, shoving quintessence into a feeling, thing that you can do in Mage. Yeah, so Prime is the other one that kind of lets you actually do things as opposed to just see things. All the others are basically perception, but then there's Mind and Prime that kind of sit outside of that nice, easy symmetry of you can perceive the stuff of this sphere with things like turning health into quintessence and consecration and absorbing more quintessence than your avatar from the node and so on. If you have access to quintessence, or if you feel like you need quintessence and your health isn't all that important to you, then Prime 1 is super useful.
Spirit One grants you Spirit Sight. You can peek into the penumbra through the appropriate Vidare, or if you're in my game, the Vidare of your choice, because I treat the 3 as 3 separate penumbrae. You can determine the gauntlet's thickness. You can detect the presence of spirits. You can see auras, because there's 3 different ways to do that in Mage, which I'm actually fine with. You can read someone's emotional state. That one made no sense to me, but sure. You can spot a spirit mark, which is a sign that someone has made an agreement with a totem or is cursed, or that is the way they feed a familiar. There's a bunch of different ways that it works. To me, Spirit, again, is one of those things where if you're in a game that uses Spirit does everything seemingly, which I've always been kind of about. But yeah, this one does a bunch.
On that last question, I have a kind of ad hoc, I intend to write it up someday, but it's not on my roadmap at the moment, set of rules for, kind of how hard is the chiminage to get a spirit to do the thing you're asking for, in order to kind of balance it out, where roughly it ends up being not actually significantly easier to get a spirit to do the thing than to just do it, get the spheres and do it yourself, but it might be faster. So yeah, you don't have to spend all the XP, but if you want a spirit to do a Forces 5 thing for you, you are paying for that. And it might be easier just to call up Porthos and say, hey, you owe me a favor.
Yeah, my reading for Chiminage has always been one of those things where it is a case of turning time into an economy, where either you can do a bunch of oblation for a spirit or entity and call upon it in a time of need, or just like borrowing money from the bank, you're going to pay them back more than you borrowed. You can get the spirit to do something, but in the long term, it is going to take vastly more of your time than it would have done. So to me, it is I almost view Chiminage as a economic question in terms of the resources of time and other backgrounds.
Yeah, the important thing there is that it keeps us, you can always find whatever you want to accomplish, you can find a spirit who can do it. But are you willing to pay their price?
And there is a price to asking, in my opinion, too.
Oh yeah. Like if you just ask, get the price from the spirit and say, you know what, too rich for my blood, and you do that a bunch of times, you now have a reputation. Mm-hmm. I ignore auras completely, so I don't do that. But yeah, you covered spirit pretty solidly. The emotional state one is sure, why not? When you're dealing with characters with first dot stuff, be generous. Mm-hmm. Like probably the way I would interpret you can read someone's emotional state is if you really take the World of Darkness as completely animistic to its logical extreme. Okay, they're happy. There's little joy spirits following them around, either feeding on the happiness, generating the happiness, or being created by the happiness, depending on how you read the words that are printed in the books. That could mean many things.
Yeah.
So you're not detecting that they are happy. You're detecting that they are surrounded by spirits of happiness.
Okay, yeah, there's a little piffling or something of joy that is like dancing about them.
Yeah. And if they ate a person for dinner last night, there's a cannibal spirit following them around. Yeah. You can get a lot of information out of just what spirits are following people around.
Yeah. The last sphere to discuss, time. It gives you a remarkably precise internal clock, which to me allows you to ape some of the effects that you could do with forces, where you could estimate trajectory and so on, time plus correspondence, but we'll talk about conjunctional effects later. You can spot temporal ripples of time effects. For me, this includes both anchor points as well as hanging effects. You don't know necessarily what it is, but you're like, there's something following this dude around.
There's a thing.
Yeah. And one of the most powerful is time in. How do you do this? Time 1 is listed as you can read the skeins of time to determine the right action to do something they refer to as simple. Figure out the right time to strike at someone, figure out the right moment to make an entry, figure out the right moment to raise your hand to call a taxi. Any simple action. To me, it is when you are unilaterally acting that it would be included in this. And with other spheres, they list anything but mind. You can come up with a much more detailed, quote unquote, perfect moment.
Yeah, in fairly unserious game I ran, Time 1 was used to determine the exact appropriate time to drop a banana peel in someone's path.
Kind of reminds me of like the second episode of Daredevil where you just see Charlie Cox with a fire extinguisher holding it over a stairwell and him like counting the person's steps and just releasing it at a critical point, and then you just hear the thing clatter against the skull or something like that. You're like, that's time 1.
Yeah, so time is one of the spheres that to me has been mundanified more than some of the others, especially at first thought. Like, I have a terribly precise internal clock. I also have a cell phone that is getting updated from an atomic clock constantly. Knowing what time it is in 1400 is a much more impressive thing, especially if you know precisely how long it has been since something happened. Like, I think there's some references to using time 1 and with an effect, with an instrument of like a cigarette that you're smoking to time things. Yeah, in the time before everyone had a stopwatch accurate to thousandths of a second in their pocket, that was a really useful way to coordinate actions between people that couldn't communicate securely. That describes most of human history.
I will frequently have weird places where time flows slightly differently. So to me, this is also a case of kind of sense shallowing or detect the liminal. I don't know if I would go full on spirit and say, oh, time 1 can help you detect a vampire haven because time is seemingly stopped here. But again, I tend to be pretty generous as seemingly so does Charles.
I would allow time 1 not to detect the vampire haven, but to detect vampires.
Oh, just because
these are their essential stasis.
Yeah.
Vampires are so easy to detect. It's kind of mysterious how there's so many of them.
Yeah. If only there were more mages and they didn't outnumber mages by like 10 to 1.
Or if only, people had infrared security cameras everywhere in London. There should be no vampires in London, just saying.
Werewolves, on the other hand. That was just a Warren Zevon reference. So we've discussed the spheres themselves. The book also gives us several conjunctional effects that include several. For instance, Life 1, Entropy 1. You can detect someone's inclination towards misfortune or future sickness. And to me, this is having 1 dot and 23 in me. The Life 1, Matter 1, you can detect implants or somebody smuggling something is the polite way I have of putting that. Mind 1, Matter 1, detect the feeling of a place, which I kind of liked. I tend to hew towards the Mage core description that people have resonances and places have synergies. I haven't been able to make a lot of sense out of the system that's been presented in Book of Secrets. So to me, Mind 1, Matter 1 lets you detect the feeling of a place, which I would consider to be useful.
I end up just simplifying and saying everything has resonance. There's no subdivisions of resonance. It's just adjectives that describe things that have and ratings for how strong it is. And Mind 1, Matter 1 let you get vibes.
Reasonably specific and somewhat useful vibes.
Yeah.
So Spirit 1 plus a pattern sphere can determine if something is possessed, whether it be a person, or if something is, to me, a vessel for one of the earthbound, or if something is a fetish, or something with a capital F.
See, now you got me thinking about what possessing a force looks like, and I think I've got some ideas for my next game.
I think you can have the Winds of Rage or something blow across a city. With Time 1, you can do, and anything but mind. I thought this was interesting. You can extend the perfect moment idea that you can figure it out for a more complicated action. You can use Time 1, Life 1 to notice when someone is particularly receptive mood, Forces 1 to time your actions with appropriate energies along with Time 1. To me, Time 1 plus sphere is your generic, I want to reduce this difficulty by 1 or increase their difficulty by 1. It's kind of your a universal modifier as presented. For the technocracy, it indicates that Life 1, Matter 1, Dimensional Science 1 just kind of spots reality deviance. It specifically lists vampire, werewolves, and aliens in that list. But yeah, seems like that'd be something they would be doing a lot of.
So we finally have a canonical effect for finding the Zig.
Yes, I'm pretty sure when they say aliens, they are just kind of referring to ghosts. I think it's easy enough to figure out.
It makes more sense to be referring to changelings.
Yeah, that to me would be Mind 1. I always like the weird sphere associations where like, oh, you want to detect a mummy? You need life and prime, which I think was listed exactly once. We never got anything that was tied to correspondence or time, I don't think. And I think that would be interesting.
We need more game lines.
I'm perfectly fine with that. To me, Time 1 would work for the Chronicle of Darkness, Mummy the Cursed, as they kind of have their nonlinear relationship with being around. Do you have any other conjunctional effects that come to mind when you think of 1 dots of things?
And there's a few that have appeared in various books because, as everyone knows, I'm kind of the rote guy. Mm-hmm. And I think one of my favorites was a version of something that, so it's sort of an enhanced version of that correspondence effect that gives you, the bird's eye view of the battlefield. I think it was called heads up display, and it's like core 1, life 1, matter 1, forces 1, time 1. You are getting every bit of useful information for coordinating a battle that you could hope for. Like, where everyone is, where everything is, how they're moving, where they're going to. You can basically work out where they're going to be in a moment, and you can react basically instantly because you're getting the information at just a tiny fraction of a second before it's actually happening.
You're getting it at the speed of magic. The other one that came to mind is with the one-dot effects. In my opinion, in a lot of cases, you can buy off penalties that would come from this. For instance, Correspondence 1, you have perfect blind fighting, or close enough to. You have no idea what color anyone's clothing is, but just because someone threw sand in your eyes, you can continue without too much difficulty outside of the pain of having sand in your eyes. Likewise, in one of the previous editions, this hasn't necessarily carried into Mage 20th, is you can Karum shots. You can use, I think it recommended Correspondence 1, Life 1, Matter 1, Forces 1, to let you graze a bullet off of something and hit someone from an odd angle without penalty. And I am perfectly fine with conjunctional one-dot effects eliminating penalties for certain things if you can come up with a justification for it.
Just make it absolutely possible that you could pull off the magic bullet. Certain conspiratorial films.
Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, gotcha. But Mage, if you use the full set of maneuvers, to me, a lot of the one-dot effects remove those. For instance, the penalty for dealing with multiple combatants. One of the weirdest things to me to come out of Mage 20 is if 4 people are fighting 4 people and they both have moderate cover, no one can ever die because everyone is doing everything at +5 difficulty. Things I try not to think about. But to me, Correspondence 1 or Life 1 would let you nullify that because you have perfect awareness of where everyone in the battlefield is, and you kind of let your avatar take care of that. I think there are a lot of creative uses of removing penalties that allow your mage to act in ways that are not necessarily obviously superhuman, but obviously at or near the pinnacle of what a person could do. Another one that is listed is a lot of the first dot and second dot levels allow you to dodge explosions. Again, this is a case where they list every sphere but mind as allowing you to be like, something's going to go boom. You may want to get out of dodge. And that also goes.
I can justify doing that with mine.
I know, that's the weird one. You're like, I'm getting the sense of this guy, the part of this guy's brain dedicated.
That guy's gonna blow something up.
Exactly.
I should dodge.
Yeah. There are a bunch of things, as we've mentioned, that several spheres can do. Punch things good. Life 1, Matter 1, Entropy 1, all allow for some sort of know where to hit. Correspondence 1 will aid in dodging, as will Time 1. Again, be pretty liberal. Perceive auras can be done with Life 1 and Prime 1 or Mind or Spirit. And it says for +1 difficulty...
Like vampires.
Yeah. For +1 difficulty, you can read the auras of spirits or the undead. And I'm like, cool. And I think the last one to consider is counter magic. You only need 1 dot and sphere to do basic counter magic for anything incoming, and that is enough to make a fair difference even with 2 points of Arete, especially if the fireball is coming at your entire group. I would be perfectly fine if everyone kind of pulls successes to reduce that explosion.
I think that's something that we forgot under Prime, because there's 2 types of counter magic in Mage. Mm-hmm. There's, I have the same sphere, so I'm going to counter your effect directly, and then there's, I'm just going to make magic harder now.
Yeah, at the point of 1 quintessence per point. Yeah, I think we've gone through a pretty, I don't want to quite say exhaustive, but I think we've had a pretty encyclopedic thing of going through what each of the spheres does at 1 dot. Do you have any closing thoughts or ideas or recommendations for people who are running low Arete mages or characters that generally only have 1 dot in spheres?
To this day, Initiates of the Arts is a great book. Mm-hmm. I recommend looking at that because it has quite a few ideas about what you can do with 1 dot, the 1 dot and conjunctional effects with 1 dot. Even when you start with higher Arete, I basically never start a character with 2 spheres at 3. I usually go 3, 2, 1 because that 1 sphere that 1 dot is so useful if you put it in a sphere that will be useful to your character and how they see the world. And it's also a character building thing. Mm-hmm. Like, how does it change your character that they can perceive how matter works but not how life works? We were mostly thinking about what happens if you have a character with Arete 1, but your character with Arete 4 can still have a sphere or 2 at 1 dot, and it's super useful to them. I've definitely had characters where my first dot, where the sphere I had 1 dot of turned out to be more useful than the sphere I had 3 dots of.
The big thing for me is if you're doing an Apprentice Chronicle, try and come up with challenges that take advantage of needing a slight change in difficulty or where a little bit more information is useful. If you are navigating Chantry politics, everyone gets to know when everyone else is kind of lying. And to me, that kind of adds an interesting angle to things. Like, no one is necessarily being telepathic at this low-level Hermetic Chantry game where you're all going through the process of becoming baby Hermetics or something like that. But you could detect when people are lying unless they're starting to use counter magic. The other one to me is the one-dot spheres allow your characters to do CSI Mage in a way that I think is very interesting.
Just imagine what kind of hell high school would be if no one could lie.
If no one could lie, and you could always tell when someone was embarrassed.
Oh God!
Children are vicious in a way that
that's your game set at the Force Collegius.
So we just did a very systematic walkthrough of this. Charles, it's been a bit since we've talked to you. Anything that you've done that you would like to have the world know about, or anything that we should expect to see from you in maybe the next few weeks?
I was a writer on M20 Sorcerer, which hopefully will be coming out soon. Hopefully it's out by the time this airs.
Or at least exists to the point that we can talk about it.
And if you would like to have me back on to talk about it once it's in your hands, I would love to. I have expanded beyond Mage a little bit. I am one of the writers on Aberrant, Hated and Feared, and for those who know both systems, I have some ideas about adapting mega attributes to handle archspheres. Yeah, I have a Patreon. I'm continuing to put stuff out on Storyteller's Vault. At the time of recording, I am editing, hopefully for release in the next week or so, a smaller piece with some corporations that are pushing various tradition interests intended kind of as a companion to Rich Bastard's Guide. You need to figure out how your character is getting 6 dots of resources. Well, maybe they work maybe they work high up in one of these places.
Can you give us one example that is a corporation from a group that we don't normally think of corporately?
So I've got a green energy company run by Dream Speakers that make deals with sun spirits to make the solar panels more efficient.
Reasonable. Nice.
As an example, they are directly challenging Endron for those of you who know Pentex.
And once any of those are out, we look forward to either advertising it or talking about you further. But when those happen, we look forward to sharing it with our audience. Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where we'd use Correspondence 1 to precisely key cars that were passing by that weren't paying enough attention to where pedestrians with keys and magical abilities were standing. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, and they include Regina O'Reilly, Oracle of using Prime to find out if someone is lying; Buck Farmer, Oracle of using Entropy to find out if something is flammable; Christopher Phillips, Oracle of using Time to find nodes; Jay Widener, Oracle of using Correspondence to see ghosts; and Mikhail, Oracle of using Mind to dodge explosives. Additionally, we'd like to thank Alex, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hebert, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsek, Elliot Osborne, Gargle Lenoir, George Lahr, Guy Cunn Stewart, Ea Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Carl Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aron, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo Richard Pat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, W. Starter, and Zach Rules. Our EP shout-out is to Zach Rules, who's done a bunch of StoryPath Nexus and STV books, and one in particular that you may want to look into is called Therianthropes, which is for Scion 2E and is about how shapeshifters act as kind of agents between the mortal and the divine in a number of world cultures. It's $1.50 and includes a few sample characters. I recommend it because if you're looking for an alternative to the Garu, maybe give it a peek. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.